Hey, this is Mohal Joshi from Los Angeles, California. I follow Indian foreign policy and defense with a special focus on Asia. You can follow me on Twitter at Mohal Joshi.
Hey, this is Kishor from Bengaluru in India. I am an international relations expert specializing in global security, conflict resolution, and international negotiation. My focus areas include peace building and digital diplomacy. You can find me on Twitter at Veggie Diplomat. Hello and welcome to episode 34 of India Rising, Strategic Affairs Conversations with Mohal and Kishor, a show in which we analyze the happenings from around the world and their impact on India. Before we begin with today's episode, we just hope that you and your loved ones are safe at home and are healthy during these troubled times. Remember to stay home and stay safe. A year ago, during the summer of 2020, when the world in general and India specifically was reeling under the full brunt of the COVID-19 pandemic, the soldiers of the People's Liberation Army came up to the line of actual control to occupy strategic areas across the perceived LAC, just as the snow was melting during the initial summer months. Indian government over the decades had actually bragged that the line of actual control was silent ever since the 1960s. But what transpired was a medieval one-upmanship between the soldiers of the PLA and the Indian Army at multiple places along the LAC. We had covered this in great detail in our episodes 26, 27, and 28. Sadly, 20 of our brave soldiers lost their lives while attempting to stop the PLA soldiers from entering the Galwan River Valley. What followed was a massive buildup of soldiers from both sides across multiple spots along the entire LAC, leading to a very volatile situation. Round after round of talks at Corps Commander level have been carried out, but we have very little to show in terms of bringing the temperature down in the icy cold heights. It's been a year now, and instead of the situation easing off, we have heard of soldiers from both sides digging their heels. The fact that the issue is not grabbing the headlines does not mean that the issue has gone away. Now, let's look at how the situation looks like on the ground right now. There have been 11 rounds of Corps commanders meetings followed by an agreement in February, which again we had covered in episode 32, in which both sides disengaged and de-escalated at one of the friction points on the northern and southern banks of the Pangong Tso, also called the finger areas to the north of Pangong Tso, and on the height of the Kailash range near the Spangor Gap. Even after more than a year of the standoff, which included 11 rounds of Corps Commander level meetings, 7 work mechanism for consultation and coordination, also called WMCC meetings, and at least 2 known interactions between India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. SJaishankar, and China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, the standoff remains in other areas along the LAC in Depsang, Gogra, and Hot Springs. EAM S. Jaishankar has said on record, and I quote him, India is yet to receive credible explanation for a change in China's stance towards India and massing of troops in border areas and its willingness to breach peace. He also continued, and I quote, Chinese have to date given us 5 differing explanations, unquote, behind their policy change, and noted that China is still trying to figure out not only its motivations, but also what the Chinese, I quote him, posture signals its evolution and its possible implications for the future of ties, unquote. Moving on to what the Chief of Defense Staff, General Bipin Rawat said, Chinese deployments, I quote him, Chinese deployments on the border with India have undergone a change, especially after incidents that happened in Galwan and other areas last year. Thereafter, they realized that they need to be further better trained and better prepared. Their soldiers mainly come from the civilian street. They are enlisted for a short duration. They don't have much experience of fighting in these kinds of areas and operating in this kind of terrain, unquote. Basically, General Bipin Rawat was referring to Mimong Cheton, a unit entirely consisting of local Tibetan youth who were trained by the PLA and deployed at various locations in Chumbi Valley, which is situated across the Sikkim border with China. Indian Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla said, I quote him, "We are very clear that until these issues, the existing friction points, are addressed and our border areas are peaceful and tranquil, we will not be able to go into what is known as a normal relationship as we go forward. I think the entire basis of that relationship has been predicated on having peace and tranquility on our borders." And he also added that the onus is on China to ensure that the issues that remain are addressed, unquote. So as you see that a lot of extreme positions have been taken, and as a add-on to that, both the PLA and the Indian Army have strengthened their positions along the LAC. So Mohal, do you want to elaborate on how both of them have strengthened their positions?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of reorganization and movement even within the Indian Army. So, for example, the Mathura-based One Corps, which was the strike-based corps oriented to face Pakistan, will now be an offensive formation for Eastern Ladakh to support the existing Leh-based 14 Corps. The Dehradun-based 14 Division will now be in charge of the central sector in Uttarakhand, I mean, which was just manned by, I believe, like a couple of brigades earlier. The Palampur-based 39 Division, currently in Eastern Ladakh, I mean, post the events of summer 2020, which was like pushed in to beef up the strength in that area, will go back to being a reserve force under a Northern Army command once the standoff is over, whenever it be in the future. The well-known 17 Mountain Strike Corps, which was raised to face the Chinese all along the LAC, is now being exclusively dedicated to the Eastern Command that is in the Northeast. Um, India also, as per reports, has deployed the M777 ultralight howitzer that we bought from the United States, the Apache multi-role attack helicopters, the heavy lift C-17, C-130J transport aircraft, Chinook heavy lift helicopters, and the recently inducted and the well-known Rafale fighter aircraft into Ladakh to strengthen India's capabilities in this region, you know. Interestingly, like a few days ago, Bloomberg had also reported that India had deployed an additional 50,000 troops into the along the LAC, which is almost like a 40% increase versus the past deployments. Which and this brings the total number of troops along the LAC to almost 200,000 troops. You know,
which is quite a massive buildup.
uh, yeah. I mean, when you consider that the Indian Army is like, I believe, like around like 12 lakh troops. So, I mean, if you like the 2 lakh, it's like almost one in every 6 soldier is in the LAC right now. In theory, you know. Um, so coming to the PLA side, I mean, they have upgraded their Hotan airbase in Xinjiang and then Niginji airbase in Tibet. Both the bases are just across the LAC in Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh, respectively. With the PLA deploying also supposedly the S-400 air defense squadrons to protect them from the Indian aerial threat. Recently, like we saw pictures where the Chinese were building HAS or hardened aircraft shelter, that is reinforced hangars to protect their military aircraft from an enemy attack in Tibet. China also, as per some satellite imagery, has deployed its lightweight Type 15 T-99 T-96 tanks, the PCL-181 vehicle mounted howitzers, ZBL-09 infantry fighting vehicles in the Aksai Chin area to back up their forces. And the PLAF, which is the PLA Air Force, has moved various surface to air missile systems, and the J-10, the J-11, and the J-20 fighter aircraft, along with Z-9 and Z-20 helicopters in the Tibetan area.
Mm-hmm. Okay, okay. So again, quite a build-up by the PLA as well.
Hmm.
Mm, okay, so again, curious to know what is the stand of the Chinese about the entire LAC skirmish.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at the overall strategic picture, like many in China see India is, I mean, a challenger to its supremacy in Asia. I mean, no other country comes close to challenging China in the at least the Asian continent. So
Right.
the belief in Chinese strategic circles is that India is acting on the behest of, and I quote, like hegemonic powers like the US. So
Mm-hmm.
interestingly, like Ashok Kanta, the former ambassador to China, mentioned on a, podcast that in the track to meets with Chinese scholars, what they say is that India is making a misjudgment by aligning with the US, United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Hemant Adlaka, an associate professor of at the Center for Chinese and South Asian Studies at the School of Language and Literature Studies at JNU, says that he finds a theme in the writings by Chinese scholars where the theme is that where is India getting this audacity to stand up to China,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's something like the Chinese scholars are also befuddled that how come India is suddenly acting up like as if it's like a very strong nation.
Mm.
Further, there's also mention of how the gradual deepening of ties between India and China, uh, which is also causing like some heartburn in the
Mm.
Chinese strategic circles.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean in India, I mean if you know, like we are always inundated with hours and hours upon on airtime on the television and meters upon meters of newspaper columns and op-eds, some of which frankly are like sound very pessimistic. But I mean, and as you know, every confrontation with China brings about bewilderment and a lot of head scratching on how to deal with the dragon. I think something which is underappreciated is that I mean, similarly in China, I mean, in spite being of a superior power, I mean, in multiple realms, which are vis-a-vis India, they're also dealing with a unique challenge from India. Now, China, if you know, like has gotten its way by intimidation and bullying with many of its smaller nations in Asia, neighbors in Asia, especially in terms of territorial disputes.
Mm.
One can simply look at all the territorial gains that they have made in the South China Sea over the past few years without much of a physical confrontation with the ASEAN nations.
Right.
When it comes to India, which it always considers inferior, I mean, they're always quick to remind India that, oh, we are like 5 times bigger than you whenever the tensions are running high in terms of border disputes with India. I mean, it has surprisingly not been able to get its way as seen in Doklam in 2017 and Eastern Ladakh in 2020.
Mm.
Granted, they have blocked uh, India from patrolling like its perception of LAC in certain locations.
Mm.
So, I mean, this is something like an underappreciated fact, I think. I mean, the other thing is that the opaque nature of the Chinese state, plus the language barrier, like where like everything in Mandarin doesn't get to a wider audience out here in India, is
Right.
a vastly underappreciated fact by many in India. That even in China, there is some amount of like it's a frustration of not being able to fully push India around as per its liking. I mean, they do. Uh, Give a lot of heartburn to the Indian strategic circles, but also they are not able to fully, wield the amount of leverage or power that they can make India do whatever they would want them to do.
Mm. Mm.
So interestingly, like I mean, Antara Goshal Singh, like a research associated at Center of for Social and Economic Progress, recently said, and I quote her: "An influential section within the Chinese strategic community believes that China's cooperative approach towards India in the past years has failed to deliver desired benefits, particularly reduction in strategic pressure on China in the southwestern direction." So that it can concentrate on facing its main strategic opponent, the United States. and therefore China's India policy from here on should focus on an occasional show of strength or an
Mhm.
assertion of Chinese strength advantage vis-a-vis India from time to time, so as to effectively check and balance a rising and a more confident India and undercut what is considered as its strategic opportunity period induced by the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific.
Mhm.
So, I mean, Chinese scholars and strategists do agree that it's not in Chinese interest to have an active military confrontation with India. I mean, China's main theater of focus is to the east, in the the South China Sea and the Western Pacific.
Right.
Um, Chinese hardliners and moderates both seem to agree that there is no point of going to war to India, which will permanently rupture the relationship. I mean, in their minds, assuming it's has not already happened in some of for some on the Indian side post the events of Galwan, in
Mm.
last June. But I mean, as per the comments above from Antara Ghoshal saying, like they will keep needling India from time to time, while also actively trying to remain below the threshold of an active war from breaking out. So they still, I mean, which is like all the classic telltale signs of classic gray zone warfare. They want to not provoke an active war, I mean, a hot war with India, but also they want to keep needling India. So they sort of like, put India back in its place
Mm,
kind of
mm, mm, mm.
thinking.
Right. Right.
So, Kishore, how this standing their ground by both is seen as a threat by the other side?
So again, yeah, with this kind of a extreme position taken by both the sides, it's interesting to see what are the kind of statements made by the people who actually matter. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was actually quoted in Global Times as saying, I quote him, the root cause of tensions along the Indo-China border is that India has been increasing the military deployment along the border area and encroaching on China's territory. China does not agree to link the boundary issue with the bilateral relations, unquote. Now, one of the major takeaways from this statement is that there is a diametrically opposite point of view on both sides regarding the border issue and the overall relationship. For example, External Affairs Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar has said, and I quote him, the bottom line for the relationship is clear. Peace and tranquility must prevail on the border if the progress made in the last 3 decades is not to be jeopardized. Cooperation between India and China, he stressed, has advanced steadily in the last 3 decades on grounds that peace and tranquility was maintained and that the LAC was both observed and respected by both sides. But now that there is a crisis at the LAC, it cannot be business as usual. Again, I quote him, one cannot have friction, bloodshed, and intimidation on the border and then say, let's have a good relationship in the other domains. Unquote. Jaishankar has stated while also emphasizing that, quote, the border and the future of China-India ties cannot be separated, unquote. Um, in addition to this, the Chinese ambassador to India, Sun Weidong, has said, and I quote him, clarifying the LAC could create new disputes and further hamper the process of maintaining peace and tranquility in the border areas, unquote. Again, a lady you referred to, Mohal, Antara Goshal Singh, had kind of implied that, again, I quote her here, bilateral relations could be normalized and improved that were normalized and improved in 1988 when India finally agreed to decouple the border issue from the rest of the relationship. Since then, successive leaderships in both countries have tried to downplay the boundary issue for the sake of overall advancement of China-India ties. However, the present Indian government is trying to relink the border dispute with the progress in bilateral relations, which not only violates the bilateral consensus to not allow differences to rise into disputes, but can also create insurmountable obstacles to the long-term development of bilateral ties, unquote. So while China
Yeah, I
wants,
mean, just wanted to reiterate that this was a statement from Lu Chunhao, the
Mhm.
deputy director of an associate researcher at Chinese Institute of Contemporary International Relations.
And that was quoted by Antara Goshal Singh,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So while China wanted India to shelve the border dispute to work on other areas of cooperation, while downplaying the border issue, India is saying that the border issue is a massive issue, which is not a trivial matter and cannot be put aside in context of the overall relationship. Now, this is kind of how India-Pakistan relationship has kind of evolved in the past 3-4 decades. Earlier, India used to say that Jammu and Kashmir issue can be kept in the back burner, and other issues or other aspects of bilateral relationship can be taken forward, while Pakistan did not agree to it. But later, as terrorism became a bigger issue for India, India said unless and until terrorism is discussed front and center, every other issue cannot be discussed. So that is how bilateral relationships have actually taken shape when it comes to India Pakistan. And we are seeing something similar in the Indo China relationship as well. Now, as we have mentioned in our earlier podcast, since the standoff began a year ago, China sees no value in settling the border issue. I mean, that's quite obvious. There is no appetite or willingness, even among the Chinese scholars, for clarification of the LAC, and they don't like India stressing on working towards resolving the border issue to facilitate improving of the ties with New Delhi and Beijing. An unsettled border works to Chinese advantage and Chinese interests, as it would keep India on edge and off balance. Any settlement of the border issue would rob the Chinese of one more card or one more ace to keep an ascendant India in check. As we mentioned earlier in the podcast, India reoriented one of its strike core from the western to the northern front. If such an event occurred, then India can now move forces back to the Pakistan border, where it would put more pressure on China's so-called iron brother, which would not again be in Chinese interest. So yeah, that's the kind of extreme positions taken by both of them. Mohal, do you want to elaborate on how flexing their muscles by both is seen as a threat by the other?
Yeah, I mean, the other major point from the Chinese foreign minister statement in the Global Times was him saying that the root cause of tensions along the China India border is that India has been increasing military deployment along the border area.
Mm-hmm.
Now, many have speculated on the actual reason for Chinese incursion into the eastern Ladakh area in 2020. And it would be like, I mean, near impossible to be 100% certain on the actual root causes given the opaque nature of the Chinese side. I believe even our external affairs minister SJaishankar mentioned that Chinese have given an astonishing five different reasons for why
Mm.
the standoff had occurred. So, um, but one thing, if the statement makes it clear, is that the development of border infrastructure, I mean, when they say military deployment, we are not like we didn't pump in new forces, but it was the additional deployment of additional deployment of development of border infrastructure from the Indian side, if had a major contributing, if not fully, to the Chinese reaction in the summer of 2020. So now we had mentioned this in the earlier episode 27, 26 of India Rising podcast, that China had, I mean, an early mover's advantage as far as the border infrastructure was concerned. The asymmetry in border infrastructure gave the Chinese an upper hand all these years, and they were okay with it as long as India was lacking in this regard. Now,
Mm.
India, for a very long time, even after the defeat in 1962 war, neglected to build robust infrastructure along, near the LAC. So the Chinese, having enjoyed a dominance in the infrastructure domain in the past, are now waking up to the fact that, hey, the gap with India is slowly decreasing, and we are going to be our advantage is diminishing.
Mm.
Now with this rapid deployment of border infrastructure, like in the past decade, which has recently amped up in the past few years under the current NDA administration,
Mhm.
The Chinese seem to be unhappy that this historical advantage is being eroded gradually. I mean, on a positive note, the this current standoff has put the infrastructure even into even a more accelerated phase where projects are being swiftly completed with even more urgency than ever before. I mean, as per a report in the Times of India, the BRO had completed 1,200 kilometers of road formation works and 28 2,850 kilometers of surfacing works over the last 1 year, most of which was facing the Chinese, I mean, the LAC or the Chinese border.
Mm.
Of the 61 roads with BRO that were like considered strategic roads, like 45 have been completed, while connectivity has achieved on 59 of them. And seven of the last nine roads will be completed by March 2022. So that would be probably like, I guess, 10 months from now, I guess, or like I guess give or take like 9 to 10 months, and the other two by March 2023. So like maybe 22 months, I guess.
Mm.
And then the BRO has completed also, interestingly, like 74 permanent bridges and 33 Bailey bridges over the last 1 year. So this shows that we have like I mean, we are like pretty much near like the existing roadworks, in terms of like maybe by March of next year, majority of this infrastructure will be built. um, Also, an army official was reported in India today saying that there is a four, I mean, I quote him, there is a 4 to 5 year roadmap for border development, deployments and logistics. Whatever was planned for Ladakh for this period has been achieved in 1 year, ensuring our trips can sustain for long. So this shows that like something which was planned over a course of 4 or 5 years has been finished, I mean, within
Mm. Mm.
like 1 year. So this shows like the massive speeding up of infrastructure. And I think even during the standoff, I think it was building like Raksha Mantri Rajnath Singh, he mentioned that there would be no slowdown in the border infrastructure. I think the stand-up just gave a more fillip to just made India more determined to finish the infrastructure as soon as possible and not wait for a longer period of time.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, this diminishing first mover advantage we had mentioned in episode 27 of India Rising podcast, which says like, like, hey, the Chinese are now in a quandary, right? So I mean, they would have to make a decision that, hey, like, should we create the standoff right now? I mean, should we create a confrontation with India right now, or should we do it later when their advantage would have completely eroded or eroded to a large extent? So, I mean, China, I mean, as you know, in spite of being of a significant power, has shown from time to time some baffling insecurities and paranoia about its adversaries and neighbors. So, in a rising Indian threat in terms of more border infrastructure being developed would definitely, given the Chinese psyche, create um, I mean, would make like the Chinese more anxious and could prompt her to take steps to, like, let's say, put India in her place, like
Mm.
they feel they did during the 1962 war. So these all combine with what Beijing considers a muscular foreign policy from the incumbent NDA government, the Prime Minister Modi, would have just forced their hand to say like, hey, let's act now before it is too late, and in the future it might be, let's say, much, not impossible obviously, but like much harder to uh, like secure the strategic areas that they deem they need to maintain their advantage in this area. So it just might be that India building up the border infrastructure possibly creates a Thucydides trap conflict between India and China. I mean, I'll reiterate what I said back in episode 27 post Galwan, that the events of June 15, 2020 could possibly be viewed as a Conga La incident of the modern times. I mean, if you hark back to 1959, October 21st, like 9 CRPF personnel went on a patrol were killed in a clash with PLA. Now, this event back then hardened Indian opinion, I mean, domestic opinion against Chinese uh, intrusions into Aksai Chin, and led to a chain of events which eventually led to the 1962 war. So
Mm.
we could be looking at an unavoidable path to a bigger military clash between India and China. Maybe let's say like 5 to 10. I mean, at least in 5 to 10 years, if not earlier. I mean, once the border infrastructure is completed, I mean, the advantage could have severely eroded for the Chinese. So they might, I mean, it's not like they might be actively looking for war, as we mentioned, like, but you never know, like pushing even a piecemeal effort here and there, or salami slicing, whatever you want to call it, here and there, eventually, like, at some point, the Indian forces might react in a way where Chinese might not take to it too kindly, and some
Hmm.
local commander, if he goes berserk, and I mean, we could be just looking at a Bilger. I mean, it might not be a full-fledged war across two fronts, but it could easily be like a 1967 Nathula incident where we could have a lot of casualties on both sides, and there could be a serious military escalation between India and China, because I think China does realize that their time is running out in terms of losing the first mover advantage, you know.
Right.
So Kishore, we did talk a lot about the Chinese angle. What about the Indian angle, and here and in the standoff, and what should India do next?
Okay, so again, India's aim is what again External Affairs Minister SJaishankar has said, and also reiterated recently by Lieutenant General S.L. Narasimhan, retired member of the National Security Advisory Board, and also Director General Center for Contemporary China Studies, in an interview, is that India wanted disengagement, that is, troops on both sides move away from being so close to each other so that it reduces the tension and the chance of any untoward incident, and also followed by de-escalation, that is removal of additional forces that have come near or close to the LAC in the summer of 2020, and then eventually later followed by an improvement in bilateral relationships. So this is the kind of step-by-step progress that India is advocating. Again, Jaishankar has gone on record in saying that the relationship is, I quote him, is going through a very difficult phase because of violation of agreements and understandings of many years. And according to him, the Chinese have deployed a very large part of the military on or close to the line of actual control without explanation. He also opined that, again, I quote him, we have been very clear with the Chinese that peace and tranquility on the border and border areas is absolutely essential to the development of our relationship. One cannot have friction, bloodshed, intimidation on the border and then say, let's have a good relationship in other domains, unquote. Now, that kind of drawing of parallel by the minister explains why the Indian government went ahead with banning those 59 apps which were of Chinese origin. Although some people might have felt that this was a knee jerk reaction, it is obvious that China wants to express its displeasure about the border conflagrations by saying that things cannot be rosy in other domains. In fact, the latest salvo from the Indian government was to completely ban Huawei from participating in the 5G trials conducted in India. From an Indian perspective, one sees that the old existing confidence building measures, also called CBMs, have clearly failed. The Chinese, while withdrawing from Pangong Tso, have now refused to vacate the other areas of contention. India will have to maintain an elevated military presence on the ground to make sure that there are no more Chinese incursions all along the LAC. As we had mentioned in episode 27 of India Rising podcast, that this standoff was likely to be a protracted affair like the Sundarong-Chu standoff between India and China in 1986. The elongated standoff is bound to increase the revenue expenditure, eating into the overall defense budget. This will hit the capital expenditure purchases, which are urgently needed to upgrade the rapidly aging hardware of the Indian armed forces. China again would be content to have its forces, if need be, at the border for an extended period of time. But a longer deployment from an Indian perspective would eat into its defense budget more compared to that of China. With the pandemic having hit economic growth, coming up with a larger percentage of resources for the armed forces in the upcoming years will end up becoming a massive challenge given the diminished revenues collected by the government. Now, can India come up with a new modus vivendi with the Chinese, which involves a fresh set of CBMs? Is the $1 million question. India, like China, has no incentive in more confrontation at the border. India's long-term aim of growing its economy at a minimum of 7 to 8% and increasing the prosperity of its citizens continues to remain the top priority. The challenge is, how does India maintain the status quo at the border without losing more ground, preferably without an active military confrontation? Now, this is similar to the Chinese playbook first proposed by Deng Xiaoping, wherein he said, bide your time, hide your strength, also called the 24-carat strategy. India also has to be fully prepared for a longer and a larger military conflict along the LAC in the next few years. There cannot be a repeat of the 1962 situation where India is caught unprepared for a larger military confrontation with China. Mohal, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think the next few years is going to be definitely interesting as we complete more and more border infrastructure.
Right.
So I think with increasing frequency of patrols, more troops stationed at the border, um, the likelihood is of more confrontations, if not less. So I
Agree.
mean,
Yeah.
both the
Every spring and summer, we might have some kind of a surprise
yeah.
springing up by the Chinese.
I
Yeah.
mean, think April to November would be the time when we'll have to be on guard
Right.
for any such events. Uh, I mean December to I guess March, and we could possibly not see much action because of the winter months. But I mean, we'll have to work on to. I think India still has to a lot of work to do if they can somehow convince the Chinese to go back from the current standoff and cool down tensions.
Agree.
Then there could be a path forward for like resumption of bilateral. I think while the Chinese want to delink the border issue, I mean India has taken a firm stand that unless the border cannot be seen as a separate issue, you cannot have like tension at the border while we go about like talking about the other realms. So we will have to see how the relationship pans out. I mean, I'm not too optimistic to be on the relationship. I still think we will end up with some kind of military
Conflict. Yeah.
skirmish in the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, if I had to take a bet, maybe 5 years, but hopefully it doesn't come to that and cooler heads prevail, especially in Beijing, because I mean, if their stated goal is in the Western Pacific and Taiwan and reunification with Taiwan and control of South China Sea, I think it makes no sense for them to irk India so much that
Absolutely. Yeah.
they
Yeah.
actively, because I mean, if they have to divert resources from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, I mean, it doesn't help them at all, to achieve their primary aim. I mean, their main focus is on the United States. So this also, that's why I mean the whole goal, like if India can cool down relationships to with the Chinese to such a extent that we can sort of grow on our own without provoking the Chinese, maintain the status quo till the US and China figure out some solution. We can sort of stay under the radar kind of and
Right.
grow our strengths. Then it will be into our, because we don't want to be in the active military confrontation with the Chinese. It helps us not at all,
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I mean, it'll be hard for the Chinese to not sort of provoke India because they also see that they don't want an ascendant India.
China's running out for them as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, in Asia, it doesn't bode well for them.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, before we wind up this episode, let's switch our focus to recommendations. Mohal, you
Yeah,
want
so
to recommend
I'll
anything?
recommend this piece by Antara Ghoshal Singh that I think we quoted a few times in this podcast. So she wrote a fantastic article in the South Asian Voices .org platform on what's the stalemate that we are in Ladakh and what's beyond it, you know.
Okay, yeah, that's a fantastic piece written by her. From my end, I would want to share another article that came out in a portal called 9-line.com, written by Yash Desai. And the title reads The Galwan Valley 1 Year On, What Changed with China and the PLA. Again, this kind of explains the digging of the heel by soldiers on both sides, and also what it means to have a continued presence along the LAC. So that is my recommendation for this week. Okay, so to continue hearing about such topics, do subscribe to our channel India Rising wherever you are listening to us. If you are listening to us on YouTube, please do press the bell icon to get notifications about new episodes. If you have not left us a review yet, we urge you to do so, as it helps other listeners like you in finding us. We would also like to hear from you if you have any suggestions on any other topics that you would like us to cover. Do remember that these topics should be directly related to Indian foreign policy. Until the next time, this is Mohal and Kishor signing off.